Hello, today I'm sporting a pair of silver slippers. Yes, silver, not ruby, and heading off to follow the yellow brick road.
Follow the yellow brick road?
Follow the yellow brick road. Follow the yellow brick road. Follow, 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 follow the yellow brick road. Follow the yellow brick, follow the yellow brick, follow the yellow brick road. You're off to see the wizard, the wonderful Wizard of Oz.
Since its publication in the early 1900s, L. Frank Baum's novel, The Wizard of Oz, has been interpreted through a political, economic and sociological lens, but for most of us, the story's pretty simple. Dorothy is a young girl stranded in the magical land of Oz by a tornado who has to ask the wizard to send her back home to Kansas. She's joined on her adventure by a scarecrow in search of a brain, a tin man in search of a heart, and a cowardly lion who craves courage. Well, off the page, we're no stranger to a bit of make-believe, so joining me on the yellow brick road, a yachtswoman, Dee Caffery, writing about courage in the face of adversity, or in this case, icebergs, and a scarecrow in the form of the Telegraph's chief rock music critic, Neil Mcormick, who admits to rather overthinking things. But we begin with Stuart Heritage, representing the Tin Woodman, who lost all his limbs to an enchanted axe, and when he was put back together again, the tinsmith neglected to insert a heart. Stuart Heritage writes about film, television and music for The Guardian, and he's not someone you'd exactly describe as tactile. He once visited a hugging workshop to get over his phobia of personal contact, and later wrote about it in the paper. Did it work? Well, let's find out. Stuart, read us your piece.
I'm not a hugger. I've never been a hugger. My stiff upper lip is far too stiff for any of that nonsense. I slink away when people I know hug each other goodbye. I dash behind receiving lines at weddings to avoid that sort of thing. I do not like hugging. For me, it's the etiquette as much as anything. How do you know if the other person's expecting a hug or a kiss? What if you go in for a hug, but they go in for a kiss and you end up slobbering across their neck? Or what if you miscalculate their height and accidentally grab their arse? What if they've got a cold? What if I've got a sweaty back? Do I tell them about my sweaty back? At what point do I tell them about my sweaty back? This is one of the reasons why I left the country. About 8 years ago, I decided to move to South Korea and become an English teacher. On paper, it was a move of unparalleled genius. South Koreans are not huggers. They're not really handshakers. They're not even that fond of eye contact, the travel guide said. Brilliant. A couple of years in a country where I'd never be ambushed by a wanton act of over-familiarity. It sounded perfect. It wasn't perfect, of course. I'd forgotten what my job was going to be. I was effectively going to work at a kindergarten trying to teach and control a group of kids so young they couldn't even speak Korean, let alone English. As fun as it was, I couldn't just sit back and play guess what will make them wet themselves, although, if you're interested, for So Young it was parachutes, and for Jessica it was audio-visual representations of the Big Bang. Instead, I had to convey all sorts of frustrating ideas and concepts to them. Have you ever tried to explain what a warehouse is to a 4-year-old Korean boy? Have you? For a while, it was tough. I'd stand at one end of the room, remotely spouting gibberish they couldn't understand, and they'd largely respond by crying and wetting themselves. Eventually, it became apparent that my stiff upper lip was actually holding me back. That's when I started gooning around in front of them by singing and dancing. Although I almost died of self-consciousness, it was, as people worse than me would say, a breakthrough. An instant connection. Suddenly, the kids became more responsive and eager to learn, and for the very first time, I felt like an actual teacher. When it finally came time to leave Korea, the kids jumped me. It was an outpouring of emotion I hadn't anticipated at all. As they were group hugging me goodbye, I realised how stupid all that stiff upper lip stuff had been. I was blind, but now I could see. I would go back to England with this joy soaring in my heart. I would be a changed man. And then Jessica wet herself again. I went off hugging after that.
Stuart Heritage. In The Wizard of Oz, when Dorothy heard the Tin Man story, she decided that as long as she could get back to Kansas, it didn't really matter if he had no heart. And in fact, she was more worried about where her next meal was coming from. And I wonder, that sounds a bit like you, a bit more practical than emotional.
Well, yeah, I think, you can get through life quite easily without having to smush your body up against other people when you meet them. I think that's a bit needless. There's that film out now, Contagion, which has just put me off even being in the room with people. Just this situation's sort of freaking me out a little bit.
And Neil, you sort of coughed there.
Did your parents not hug you as a child? The absence of physical contact in this British culture is embarrassing, around the world. You go down to Italy and you're around the Mediterranean, people are hugging you and you're in the family. It feels like the bosom of a family. And then, you meet parents here who've never sort of had physical contact with their with their child. It starts very young, and I tell you, if you don't get it very young, you'll never get it later, and you'll be standing there with your dad. There'll be deathbed scenes where you're afraid to touch each other.
Yeah, I think a firm handshake's pretty good though on the way out.
What about you, Dee?
I'm the complete opposite, and I'm actually feeling for you, and I can't reach across this table to give you a hug because I think you need one.
I'm so pleased this table exists.
Nothing personal in that, I hope.
But let's get to the chase here. The Wizard of Oz is said to have a deep kind of allegorical meaning about the gold standard in America at the time it was written. But we're not going to be that complicated. We're just going to ask which of these kind of losses, the brain, the heart and courage, is going to be the most keenly felt by people. And we're obviously talking about being emotional now. Do you think, Stuart, that it's an important kind of quality to have to be able to show emotion?
It helps, I suppose, in other people. I think it's probably the least important of the three. I think you can get on quite well with brains and courage.
Well, then you would be talking about a lack of empathy, which would be the character of Kevin in shall we talk about Kevin? I mean, empathy is at the core of what it is to be human, and you learn it all the time as a child through your emotional interactions with people. And without empathy, you can be as clever as anything, but you have no feeling for anybody. And that's the people running our country.
You've just described an apprentice candidate.
Yes, exactly.
I feel terrible about myself now.
I think you can exist, but I think you are lacking. Maybe.
Yeah, it is important. Now, I've tried. Well, it was mentioned in the intro. I tried going to a cuddle workshop once. You go into a room and you just cuddle strangers, which I think was probably the wrong way to go about it.
I think that may have been a tad
Did you
too
never
far.
go?
Why did you go to a cuddle workshop? What made you do that? Well, who made you do it?
Well, a friend of mine sent me an email saying, just because I think she thought it'd be hilarious to see what I'd be like in a situation full of tactile people, and it was eye-opening. It worked. As I was coming out of it, I felt like I'd lost all this important experiences from my life, and I thought I'm going to be a cuddler now. And every step further I took away from that place, I thought, oh my God, they had their hands on me.
Straight home for a shower.
Yeah,
and
pretty much. I'm back at square one now.
Wow, you're going to end up as Howard Hughes.
The Tin Man said the greatest loss I had known was the loss of my heart, and he was clearly a very passionate fellow. But and it sounds to me, Neil, as though you think it is the greatest loss, not having a heart.
All these studies of happiness, they never come up with saying being clever will make you happy, being brave will make you happy, being in a close social network, that's what makes you happy.
And
that's what
for the
we're
Tin
geared
Man,
for.
while he was in love, he was the happiest man in the world. Do you go along with that, Dee?
Well, I think what we've got here is this emotion with other people. But I can agree with you a little bit that personal emotions don't always help you. And actually it's a massive excessive waste of energy to have lots of these emotions. And, I've been in scenarios where you're out there on your own and crying really isn't going to help. But I do really bounce off people, and I'm definitely a people person. And there's nothing unfriendly about you at all. You just need to reach out and touch me.
You do seem like a very friendly person, sitting on the other side of the table.
But for Dee, can you imagine, obviously very social and huggy, and yet you spend weeks alone on a boat. How do you cope?
Well, maybe that's my problem, that I'm making up for it when I come back ashore and I see people. But to actually interact and have that non-verbal communication where it's eye contact, physical contact, and just non-stop chatter is just so nice, having been taken away from that for so long periods at a time.
And what's
really
it like
hard.
when you are away and alone?
Well, then I've got a job to do, and you just kind of focus on that and you get on with it. And that's when I say that this emotional side doesn't really help me then. It's actually focusing on all the other things that are going to make a difference, and crying can come later.
But was there a time, Stuart, when you consciously lowered your emotional shutters?
Oh God, that's a big question. I don't think so. I don't know. It's nice to keep a distance. I've always found that one of the things I like best about this country is that it takes work to get to know people. You're not just immediately someone's best friend. When I went to Korea, for example, I'd gone in thinking, I could have all this big standoffish thing. I forgot that 85% of the other people there were going to be Americans or Canadians, and you just got grappled into these bear hugs all the time. Looking back, it was this really idiotic mistake that I made.
OK, let's take another little step along the Yellow Brick Road. Dee Caffrey is our lion, and not surprisingly, she was the first woman to circumnavigate the world alone against the currents and the winds, and she's the only yachtswoman to have sailed solo around the world in both directions. She's now been made an honorary commander of the Royal Navy. In the story, The lion attacks both the Scarecrow and the Tin Man, and he's about to take a chunk out of Toto until Dorothy steps in. It turns out that his reputation is built on a roar. So, Dee, let's find out if your bark is worse than your bite. Read us your piece.
Well, deep in the Southern Ocean, tired, wet and cold, it's really hard to change to those big sails to keep the pressure on. And it's then that I need to draw on my courage, for my greatest fear is letting my team down and the people that believe in me. One massive risk in the Southern Ocean are icebergs. We surf down huge waves on the edge of control at breakneck speeds, and any collision is the end of the race. Rescue is often days away, and actually our closest chance of survival is often a fellow competitor. I've seen the magic and the beauty of icebergs and have felt firsthand the horror and the stress that they can inflict. But as you hurtle off the wave in the dark or have to go forward to change a sail as freezing water cascades down the deck, you know that there's no one else to rely on. I'm the only person who can get this done. 3 days and nights I sailed amongst the ice, looking for a clear passage through and not managing to sleep or eat. There was a spooky silence to the atmosphere and a strange calm about the waves as they played with my course. The wind shifted around, not allowing me to feel confident with my passage through the minefield of icebergs. My eyes were red-rimmed from tiredness as I focused on the horizon and tried to pick out the silhouettes of the icebergs. I was almost relieved when darkness fell, but then I was relying on luck and technology. I was glued to the radar screen in hope that it would detect the form of the hazard ahead, giving me enough time to take avoiding action. I was too stressed to eat, and I survived, fueled on adrenaline. I remember the final night, seeing the most beautiful sunset and no ice ahead of me for the first time since this nightmare began, and realising that I'd finally found the light at the end of the tunnel. Relief swept over me. My courage had seen me through the tough times, and now I had a job to do. I had to get on with sailing the boat and actually finish racing around the world.
Dee Caffrey, you're listening to Off the Page, and we're on the Yellow Brick Road with our Tin Man Stuart Heritage in search of a heart, our lion Dee Caffrey celebrating courage, and Neil Mcormick, our Scarecrow, wondering about the benefits of braininess. Dee, what you've just read there does sound like extraordinary courage to me, and it no doubt will to a lot of listeners, but when you're there, do you actually think of it as courage, or are there other ingredients out there which are getting you through?
At the time, I think I'm so focused on the element of survival, which is the raw basic of it. There's only me that can make a difference, and it's up to me to keep myself alive and my boat sailing. That you're just focused on the job at hand, and you try not to let your emotions get away with you and live in this scariness. And it's only after and you've come out the other side, you have chance for a reflection then, and I think, God, that was scary, and then the tears can come, or then the emotional overload and roller coaster can start. But at the time, you just can't let that interfere, I think.
And how scared have you been? What have been the scariest things?
Well, ice is really exciting, but also really scary, because that's the race stopper. You hit something, there's nothing else down in the south, and rescue is weeks away. And that, along with my fear of heights and having to climb the mast at different times, is something I really have to mentally overcome to just get the job done and worry about it afterwards. So there's always moments, and you can control a lot of things, but one thing we can't control is nature, and the weather and the waves definitely take control.
And have you lost friends sailing?
I do know of people that have lost their life to the sea, but I think the hardest thing is when you're in a race and you see your fellow competitors have accidents that are then causing injury or damage, and they're needing rescue, because suddenly you think, God, I'm in the same boat doing the same thing. It could happen to me. And actually that was having a massive effect on me. And I've had to really work at concentrating on my own boat and my own job and not thinking about the others too much. Stuart,
what do you make of what Dee does?
It's sort of amazing, but it's kind of... please don't take this the wrong way. Sort of insane as well. It's. I couldn't work out when you were reading that if it was courage or if you're just a bit mental, because that's...
I think there's an element of insanity that obviously helps spending 3 months at a time or more alone at sea.
How do you deal with the solitude of it when you're...
That was one of the hardest things, because as we discussed earlier with emotions, I'm quite a sociable person. I'm not a natural loner. And when I went off, which was my first trip around the world, was against the winds and currents, so what's considered the wrong way. That was 6 months. And one of the hardest things I had to learn was spending 24 hours a day with myself. And I'm actually not that funny. I've learned that. But then I get to understand myself. I've learnt loads about myself and managing myself, that now actually it's all about racing and the focus, and I'm away for a shorter amount of time because I've got a bit faster. So it's all a bit more manageable now.
Let's get back onto the Yellow Brick Road. The lion was missing courage, but it's quite a tricky thing to define. I mean, I can, and no doubt you, Stuart, and Neil can understand the bravery involved in what Dee does, but courage isn't always just being against the elements. It's a sort of difficult to define.
Courage is obviously an important thing in life, whether it's the courage that you have in a relationship and dealing with your children and so on. The kind of courage that Dee is talking about, which is an amazing human characteristic, but it's also, as Stuart says, slightly mad. It's sort of putting yourself into a really dangerous situation. Is it courage or foolhardiness? I've found myself, as a journalist and as a bit of a wild adventurer in my young, stuck up a cliff with no way down, absolutely convinced I was going to die, and thinking, that is just the most stupid thing that I've done. It wasn't brave in the end. Maybe it was brave to go up, but actually it was stupid to do it, because you end up with death by misadventure, which has to be the most foolish way to go. And when people have these terrible deaths, far at sea, knocked out by an iceberg, and people go, oh, that's awful, but other people go, well, what were they doing there on a boat on their own? What were they thinking? I like the courage of ordinary life rather than the mad courage of a foolhardy venture.
Because everyone can be a lion in their own way. It depends what your fear is, doesn't it? I mean, I would personally say I've missed an awful lot of kind of opportunities through not having the courage to take up offers of this, that and the other, because I'm scared, for example, of speaking in public, and I find this quite difficult. But everyone has their own barriers which they've got to overcome, don't they? And that's what courage is overcoming your own barriers.
Absolutely, yeah. And it can be anything like fear of rejection, I guess.
Fear of hugging.
Fear of hugging, yeah. But I'll conquer that. As soon as this is finished, you're getting a bear hug now.
I think there's courage for everybody in just pushing your comfort zone, just living outside your comfort zone and just stretching those boundaries. And of course, everyone's boundaries are very different. I mean, obviously, sailing around the world is quite extreme, and I wouldn't expect everybody to go and do it. But there's a boundary of, taking the trip out when you've just had newborn children, and that whole kind of palaver of being organised with everything in one go. Or even kind of driving your car somewhere new. People get lost and have this fear of not being able to get there. So I think it's just that comfort zone of just stretching it.
Whatever
and I
your
think
fears
it needs
are.
courage.
Yeah. I think if you take it on that level, then it might be the most important of the three qualities, because mankind relies on constant boundary pushing and progression and stuff. So, if it wasn't for people like Dee, we'd still all, be finger painting in caves somewhere, probably.
And Dee, how do you respond to Stuart and Neil's points that actually a lot of people could say that what you do is foolish, not brave?
Well, it's perceived risk and it's calculated risk, and you go through all the what-if scenarios, and you have the training and the practice and the preparation to get you through everything. And there is amazing technology these days. I can't sneeze without the team at home knowing what's happened to me now. So it really is quite safe in as far as we push. Now it's about how hard I push my boat and how fast I go. And the race team know where all the boats are, and you know where everyone is. So they really are trying to measure that risk. But it's that pushing my boundaries. I don't push my boat as hard as somebody else that's been doing it a lot longer. So I'm trying to really take that next step as well. And that takes a bit of courage. So that's where we're looking at different boundaries. And I do think it's all a personal level. And you'll pitch where you are and continue forwards.
Have you ever had that moment, the moment that I had up the side of a mountain, which I've had a couple of times in my life, when I've thought, I'm going to die now, and this is really, really stupid?
Fortunately, I haven't had that death wish conversation with myself. I've had many conversations of what on earth am I doing here? Whose stupid idea was this? And at times I've had I'd really like to get off and have a rest now, go and have a nice bubble bath, lie in a nice comfy bed and come back to it tomorrow. But I've never not wanted to do it, and I've never not wanted to finish what I set out to do. OK,
let's move on up the road. And finally, to our scarecrow, a lonely figure who is tired of being called a fool and, unsurprisingly, scared of a lighted match. Standing in for our not-too-bright spark is the Telegraph's chief music critic, Neil Mcormick, who's actually rather brainy. Neil has a weekly column in the Daily Telegraph. He's a regular guest on BBC television and radio and writes for many other papers and magazines. In another life, Neil was allegedly the first person to leave the rock band U2. We won't go there, but read us your piece.
Brains are overrated. As the Scarecrow found out in The Wizard of Oz, everyone's got one, even if their head is filled with straw. I always was one of the brainy ones in school. I even had the spectacles to prove it. Admittedly, my academic achievements were nothing to be particularly proud of. My alleged braininess was manifest more in the "what a smart arse, I suppose you think you're clever" sort of way. And I did. I think I was clever, that is. I was always something of a plotter and a schemer, coming up with grand manifestos and plans to take over the world. Trouble is, I wanted to be a rock star, not a field in which brains have ever been considered particularly important. In music, the symbolic organ is the heart, which presides over such ephemeral things as instinct, soul, feel, passion, things that brains tend to get in the way of. But I thought I could outsmart everybody. I mean, we're talking about the music business. How clever did you have to be? I had a band. We were pretty good, certainly good enough to get meetings at major record companies. But I noticed that whenever I was actually in those hallowed offices, people seemed to get upset if I expressed a strong opinion. It gradually dawned on me that artists weren't supposed to care about real-world things like marketing plans and budgets. They were supposed to be adrift somewhere in the wishy-washy, airy-fairy wonders of creativity, the realm of the heart. So in an attempt to get my band signed, I invented an imaginary management team who would go to meetings on my behalf. This was made up of my very beautiful girlfriend Gloria, who was actually a makeup artist, and a trainee doctor called Martin. I picked them because they were the most charming people I knew. The fact that they didn't know the first thing about the music business was something I considered a positive advantage, because it meant they wouldn't try and tell me what to do. So I would set everything up, brief them before meetings, then let them do all the talking, while I sat at the back, looking soulful but vague. It seemed to work. We had a showcase in central London, and every record company and publishing company that mattered turned up. I did everything for that event. I organised the venue, the PA, the lights, the catering, the marketing, and then I got up and performed a set with my band. It was a roaring success. Several top music executives declared it to be the best showcase they had ever attended. And by the end of the day, we'd been offered a deal. Well, when I say we, I don't mean the band. No one was interested in the band, but they wanted Martin and Gloria to manage other bands. So that's where my brains got me. I wanted to be a rock star. I wound up as a rock critic, which, to be fair, is probably much better suited to a talent for overthinking things.
Neil Mcormick, your plan to get Martin and Gloria to market the band is genius, even if it didn't work. But my question is, what were you really after? It didn't seem to bother you that you didn't get the contract. I think you were out to kind of manipulate the music exec and the A&R.
No, it bothered me. But, that was just one incident in 13 years of playing in bands. You set out at a certain age and you just think whatever you want in life you're going to get, especially if you kind of think you're clever and you can work out how things are. And I fell at one hurdle after another. It certainly didn't help that my friends were in U2. Cleverness isn't really rated in music, and probably it shouldn't be. In some ways, some of our greatest stars are very intelligent, and some of the people that I most admire in music, and you're never going to take away the intelligence of a Bob Dylan or an Elvis Costello or a Nick Cave. And Bono is a super smart guy. But something about the performance of music that people respond to, what makes it important to the audience and to the musicians, is about getting out of the way of yourself. And so it's not really about intelligence. It's not about not using your brain, but it's about using it in a different way so that you're not overthinking things.
Dee, what do you make of Neil's plight, where he tried to get himself a recording deal and in fact got his girlfriend and a mate?
Well, I think, your cleverness is going to have a really good effect on everybody around you. So I think you are going to attract loads of people because you're clever, but I think it's smart.
OK, so getting back to The Wizard of Oz, the Scarecrow, according to him, brains are the only thing worth having in the world. Stuart?
That's a very cold... Well, I can talk. That's a very cold way of looking at it, isn't it? I think that they are important, obviously, because... Again, it's a matter of progression. If you don't have brains, you can't kind of move on as a civilization. But
do you think we've moved on as a civilization? I tend to think we've kind of... it's like the burden of consciousness. I imagine that we were much happier hanging from the trees, eating bananas. And we don't seem to be in a wonderful place. With all the brains and all the moving on, our civilization doesn't seem to be in a wonderful place. All we're reading about is there's 8 billion people on the planet and it could all end tomorrow.
7 so far. But Dee, do you find that you must need to use your brain, obviously, to keep your kind of courage and your heart in control?
It is a mental game, but I wouldn't call myself brainy at all. And I think you learn the things you need to manage what you do. But ask me anything left of field to what I'm used to, and I'm clueless. So I'm all for learning. I'm all for exposing myself to other things. But brains to make it happen. I think, the Scarecrow did all right. He survived and got through, and he didn't have a brain, and he was cool.
Was it the Tin Man who became the king?
Oh, really? Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, because, well, kings never hug, do they?
Okay,
They have other people to do their hugging for them.
let's wind it up with just a little discussion about which of those losses would you most keenly feel? Heart, brain, or courage?
I think I've been sort of fairly convinced that it might be the heart. I think they're all important, obviously, but you could, be the cleverest, bravest person in the world, but it'd be very lonely if you didn't have anyone to brag to, I suppose.
And Neil, from what you were saying earlier, I assume that you think that as well.
I do think the heart is probably the most powerful of all, and that your empathy and connection to other people is probably what makes your life worthwhile. But the truth is, we'd like a bit of all of those. But I am generally, I'm one of those people who looks at animals that certainly don't overthink things and think, wow, that's probably the life to have. Just be in a herd of elephants wandering through the desert somewhere.
But you are an overthinker. Do you sometimes plead ignorance to kind of duck deadlines?
You can't. If you're an overthinker and you're a thinker, you can't sort of go back from anything you know. You can't switch it off.
What about you, Dee? Courage, heart, or brain? Which is?
I think that's really interesting, as in you can't switch it off. We can't switch over and make somebody hug people. We can't switch off the way we think about things. And I can't switch off rising to a challenge. If somebody says, go and climb up there and leap off of there, I go, all right then. I'm a sucker for that. So I can't turn it off, but I would not want to live my life alone. So I've got to go with the heart, I think, ultimately. I think that would be the greatest missing piece to fulfil your life to the max.
Well, everyone agrees that, except me. I think I would probably say courage. But be that as it may, my guests have been Dee Caffrey, Stuart Heritage and Neil Mcormick. Thank you all for joining me on the Yellow Brick Road. All that remains for me is to tap my silver slippers together 3 times.